Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm going to hand over to Philip to introduce the session first before we get into our panel discussion. So, Philip, over to you for welcoming remarks and an introduction.
Wonderful, and good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that we are finally here at the UN World Data Forum. And today we will talk about the SDG Acceleration Roadmap initiative and why we as a consortium are exploring the role of business in supporting public sector data use. So first of all, we have seen a shift in how companies do business, and with far more focus right now on environmental and social impact, which has been actually a driver for us to bring a closer relationship between public-private collaboration with the data revolution community, especially on how we can trigger the work of companies, national statistical offices, civil society, among others, to contribute to accelerate the SDGs. So companies are actually helping in some cases to fill public data gaps, to transfer also knowledge and the expertise to support use for decision making. This is something that has happened already way before the so-called data revolution, but with just 7 years that we have to go, ladies and gentlemen, to achieve the SDG, we need certainly more timely data to ensure that first, the private sector is a true and meaningful partner in this data revolution by contributing to the SDGs. In particular, this role, we see this in the Global South as a vital and pivotal of importance, that we have the right enabling environment for public-private partnerships. So we need to understand, and this is one of our main questions here, on how we need to understand the extent and how the private sector has contributed to the data revolution. So we are here today, ladies and gentlemen, since 2021, Cepei, the institution I direct in Colombia, works on a consortium with IDRC supported with LDRI, the Caribbean Open Institute of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and the Center for Continuing Education from the Versailles University. And this is all coordinated with our partners from LIRNeasia. So what is our aim and what have we been doing before I hand over to my colleagues? First of all, we aim to understand how far the private sector really data-related contributions to the public policy in the Global South really extend, and how and what is the private sector doing to make more and better data to achieve and monitor the SDGs in the Global South. So we had a two-phase approach within the consortium that I just presented. First of all, we had a structured mapping of those relationships that companies support the SDGs through data. And secondly, and this is part of what our colleagues will be presenting today, are case studies on how actually companies are working together with NSOs and others to present the insights and the trends today. And this is why we have put together this panel, so that Elani Garapaya, the Chief Executive Officer from LIRNeasia, Hernan Munoz, our research associate from Cepei, also Leoninda Mutuku from LDRI in Kenya, and Maurice McNaughton from the universities of the West Indies will be contributing their ideas, their knowledge, and also their very in-depth knowledge of what is happening in the 5 regions where we did our research. And the lead on this, it's Tom Morell, who has been coordinating this group, and this is why he, of course, is moderating today's panel. I'm happy that we finally made it here to the UN World Data Forum, and to turn over the mic to Tom. Good morning to you, Tom. Tom, are you here with me? If the organizers can help me and let me know if Tom Orrell is on the line, he has been heard because I cannot.
Thomas, I see that you are online. Can you talk to us, please?
I think we are having some communication issues at this moment. If we persist, I would like to invite our first speaker, my colleague Elani Calpaya, to make her first introductory remarks until we find Tom back here to the stage. Good morning to you, Elani, as well. Good to see you.
Thank you, Philip. So I think we were going to do a quick introduction on what were some of the key findings from the region. And as you know, the 4 regions present here did both a mapping study as well as some in-depth case studies. And there is Tom. I can see him, but should I continue?
I can hear now.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay.
Someone's changed something, but thank you very much. My apologies for interrupting.
Do you want to give some comments and we start, or shall I just continue, Tom?
Could you not hear me at all when I gave some comments?
No, nobody could hear us at all.
My apologies. I don't know what happened there. It appeared as unmuted on my screen. All I was saying was good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, Philip, for those opening remarks. Helani, I don't want to interrupt your flow, so let's stick with Helani. The first question I imagine everybody is aware of now, which is to please just give us a bit of an overview of the research that you've been undertaking and to describe some of the key findings that you'd like to highlight today. So please, Helani, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. What we found, we did both the mapping study where we looked at a very regional level, what are the data actions that are going on in the Asia Pacific, and then we looked at some in-depth case studies, and maybe I'll pick up on the latter. And we looked at 2 types of partnerships or 2 types of organizations, and to highlight the importance and the role that they can play in data for SDGs. So one is the really large global companies who we see are quite involved, and we see them at even some of these meetings, right? The large global companies are really well placed to work across the region and even globally on many of the data partnerships that we are interested in, not just sharing data, but capacity building and so on. So includes, really includes capacity building for governments, civil society, providing software and tools, helping analyze data, providing technical expertise, setting policy, and so on. And also developing data standards to be shared, to be used by others. So in this respect, big companies can do things that many others can't. So one of our examples was Microsoft, which has a large number of data actions and partnerships going on around the Asia Pacific, and for a really long time, right? 10, 20 years. And they talk about their ability to go into a country, invest in the whole ecosystem, whether it's the ICT ecosystem or the data ecosystem, help develop the skills, improve digital and data literacy, and so on. These are all long-term activities, but for a company of that sort of long-standing stature and size, there's also a realistic long-term payoff, because the more digitally literate, for example, the people are, the more likely that they will also sell some of their products. So, because they are one of the largest software and cloud service providers. Now, of course, later on, we should talk about what that means in terms of small companies participating. But the big companies can really bring a lot to the table and take that long-term payoff. But the long-term benefits are great, but for any company, particularly the big ones, to sustain this kind of engagement over decades on data, right? Not just months and years. There has to be a real serious commitment to these data partnerships. And it has to be inside, and that's the only way it works. Microsoft, for example, is explicit in their commitment to data for SDGs and communicates it out. The commitment is inside as well as outside the organization. Of course, there can be serious risks, reputational, financial, ethical, also associated with giving out their data or working in partnership, particularly in partnerships that are not necessarily tied with serious contracts, but are more in-kind contributions into partnerships. So the big companies, they provide standardized ways of understanding, evaluating, and mitigating these risks when within business units, when some of their business units want to engage in data partnerships. My final point is a completely different type of organization, and those are the third parties that can broker and facilitate and really create and sustain a data ecosystem. And in this example, we looked at UN Pulse Lab Jakarta. It was set under the UN system in partnership with the government of India to accelerate innovations around data. Now, being part of the UN system, which brings a lot of sort of slow-moving bureaucracy, but it also gives a level of trust to companies and to government when they want to work with each other. So they can sit in the middle, bring organizations into the mix. They can also bring other multilateral organizations like the ILO into the mix. And the private sector tends to trust them perhaps a little bit more. But to generalize broader from Pulse Lab Jakarta is the idea that third-party brokers play a vital role not only in the introduction and setting up of partnerships, but also in the technical facilitation of pooling data, sharing data, and sometimes even providing analytical data. One of the big challenges for private companies is commercially sensitive data being given to one party, particularly if that's the only private sector company that is participating and giving data. But if a third-party player can pool more data, strip away and anonymize and pseudonymize some of the commercially sensitive data, the large set of data that they pool together can be really useful. So, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Helani. Two very different and very interesting case studies, and I'd love to find out more about what you learned through them and what they mean, I guess, for the larger ecosystem when we get round to it. But before we do that, let's hear from our other panelists as well about the research that they've been undertaking. Herman, perhaps you could share some insights from your research too.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tom. Well, as maybe was repeated from the beginning, our main question during this research was what is actually the private sector doing in our regions to make the data available to achieve and monitor the SDGs in the global south. And in this sense, what we have found is that we first mapped these 44 data initiatives that are distributed within 14 Latin American countries. And from this mapping exercise, we can conclude that not many private initiatives have been systematically incorporating into the data ecosystems for the SDGs in the countries. And we could say that the SDGs have not yet had the expected catalytic effect that it was expected to. So this mapping reinforced that conclusion in the sense that the data ecosystems in Latin America still have low participation from the private sector, which implies somehow an underexploitation of the potential of the data revolution to increase the capacities to monitor and achieve the SDG agenda. So I would say that there are data and there are initiatives. That's one main finding. There is still a lack of data initiatives in general. The companies in general are leaning toward more reporting their own impact on the SDGs through data collection and analysis, but this does not necessarily imply a strengthening of the data systems for the SDGs. And in some cases, the companies mostly disseminate reports on their environment and the impact, and they accompany their databases, but this is not necessarily strengthening the data ecosystems. But in the case of private and public partnerships, it is useful to distinguish between those partnerships that seek to identify the potential of an alternative data source to measure specific phenomena and partnerships that aim to measure them on a regular basis. And in this sense, we have found, we have worked on 2 case studies. The first one is on the INE Chile that provided insights into partnership between several Chilean retail companies that share scanner data with the National Statistical Office, the INE Chile, and that combines this data with traditional survey data to model and produce the consumer price index. And then INE now has been working with 4 major retail conglomerates, and they think they can, the scanner data can provide up to 40% of the data needed to the INE to recalculate to do the calculation of the CPI. So in this sense, what we have found is that there is a reduction of cost for the NSO in the CPI survey operation. There is new information about consumer data that has still to be explored, because this is a massive amount of data in comparison with the actual survey that they do in the field. There is the possibility of a more active cooperation with companies once they have opened this door of cooperating with the private sector from the NSO, and this exploration introduces a work with high volume of works. So they have developed in the team own skills also in terms of storage capacities, streamlining a process on how to enhance private health data. And there is also the possibility to have real-time data. That is what the data revolution is in many cases looking for. So in this case, in this association between the INE as an NSO, as a public sector, and the private, I would say that a key success factor is associated with the strategy used by them to engage with the companies. In the case of the INE, they took advantage of existing contacts with reporting focal points in the company, because they used to have a relationship for other statistics that the INE produces. So these people were already new on working protocols. Other companies are more reticent, but this is another learning process, because there was a herd effect that was generated as more companies showing it in sharing their scanner data. And I think that barriers of mistrust have been broken down, and the implementation of learning has been perfected in that sense. And it's a working process. There's one more lesson in this sense, that it was COVID. The COVID pandemic was the catalyst for that accelerated all these processes of using private health data, and the NSOs have to find a way to continue with their statistical operations. So I think that in this sense, from now on, actually, they will need to have concrete actions to promote the data sharing and generate an environment of trust, because now the pandemic is no longer operating as a catalyst for accelerating this. Our other case, and I will be a little bit briefer on this, is a case.
I think we're quite a lot over time, so if you could be very, very brief, just to highlight a couple.
Sure, yeah. Points. You continue with the other cases.
Are you sure? We can.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'll come back to you, and you can elaborate a little bit more on the recommendations, perhaps from your second case study too. But Maurice, over to you to please also share some insights from the Caribbean region.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Good night again, colleagues. So like my other colleagues from the other areas of the Global South, we also conducted a mapping exercise for several countries in the Caribbean, and selected a particular case study that was quite interesting in our context. So the case study that we had for the Caribbean was based on the Trust for the Americas. It's a nonprofit organization that's affiliated with the Organization of American States, and was established in a deliberate effort to promote public-private partnerships. So in some sense, the DNA of the Trust for Americas lends itself quite well to this kind of engagement between the public and the private sector. In fact, it's, as we found from the case study, the trust was uniquely suited for convening and mobilizing private sector actors around a development agenda, because on the one hand, they are affiliated with and support the OAS mandate, and then on the other hand, they have this kind of private sector engagement. We found the particular initiative that we studied was around digital and data capacity building. And that currently has pretty strong resonance in the Caribbean in terms of policy agenda priorities. I would just very briefly summarize 3 key findings from the case study. First of all, we found that the trust role as a convener was instrumental in creating conditions and the enabling environment for mobilizing and establishing effective public-private partnerships. So their role as a convener was actually quite important and something of a catalyst for a number of relationships that emerged. The second thing I would mention as an insight was that they built up significant social capital and relationships over a period of time. And that was quite important to leverage in terms of their ongoing ability to engage the private sector and to mobilize partnerships between the public and private sectors. So that sort of social capital is important, and is actually quite difficult to substitute for. The third key point I'd make, Tom, and we'll probably come back to this later in recommendations, is the idea that a deliberate ecosystem approach that facilitates multiple actors participating in these initiatives is quite important. So traditionally, one thinks of public-private partnerships as largely bilateral arrangements. But in this case, because the trust had a kind of convener role, then it created the possibility of engaging multiple partners around a single type of initiative. And that really does lend itself quite well to scalable and ultimately self-sustaining environment for data for development. So I think those are 3 key insights that emerged, and perhaps we can talk some more about some of the recommendations that emerged from those insights. So back over to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Maurice. That's excellent and really interesting. There are some really interesting themes emerging, and I'll summarize those in a moment. But before doing that, last but not least, our final panelist, Leonida, who is in the room. So Leonida, please, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Leonida, and I'm representing the Sub-Saharan Africa case study. So we, just like the other regions mentioned, also did a mapping of similar projects around the region, and the one that I'll be highlighting today is particularly about a partnership between a regional government in Kenya and 3 private sector companies to develop a GIS SDG lab using Earth observation data. So the government is Vihiga County, which is a subnational government in Kenya, and just like all other subnational governments are mandated by the Constitution to enact legislature, to manage budgets, but also to do planning and implementation of strategic development projects. So the Vihiga County, which is what we call our subnational government regions, partnered together with Airbus, the European company, as well as Locate IT, a startup based in Kenya, and ESRI to build a GIS lab that basically brings together observation data and remote sensing data to support planning and implementation of sustainable development goals within this regional area. And so this partnership was established about, I would say, 10 years ago and has been ongoing. And the idea was that the county would provide the facilities, the land to set up the lab, while Airbus would provide the data for remote sensing. IT would provide the technology, while Esri would also provide software to analyze this GIS data. Now, based on this partnership and our case study, we learned a number of things. For such an intricate and very technical support around data for development, it requires political will. So was it not for the governor or the head of this county having a GIS background and being spearheading rather and championing this initiative, most likely such a collaboration to use data, private data for development might not have come to the fore. Secondly, there needed to be clear incentives for each of these partners, primarily because, as you're seeing, all these resources are donated by each of these partners. And so for the private sector companies, it was a good opportunity to showcase proof of concept that these private data and remote sensing data can be applied on a periodic basis to support sustainable development goals. And then finally, the one thing that we also learned was that there was need to institutionalize these kinds of partnerships. So because in as much as there's goodwill to get it going, such a project is likely to collapse and the flow of data comes to an end if there's no institutionalization of the process of obtaining the data and utilizing it for decision making. The county government of Vihiga had to create policies and actually establish a department within the government that oversees the running of these GIS labs. However, again, because of the high level of effort to establish these initial partnerships, the likelihood for it to scale throughout the other 46 counties in Kenya is also an uphill task. And so it's a very niche collaboration with high impact, and unfortunately, can be called into question. And so the final thing also observed about this was that in spite of that, the fact that the data provided is sector agnostic, so it can be used for early warning for food and nutrition in this county, but at the same time, it was also being used for maternal health planning to make sure that prenatal and antenatal care is is taken as needed by various mothers within the county. Like, these use cases were solid enough to ensure that there was cross collaboration and to maximize the utility of the data being produced by these labs. So we will talk about challenges and recommendations as the conversation continues.
Leonida, while we have you there, actually, stay at the podium. Don't move. While we have you there, perhaps I was just going to say perhaps we could segue into those recommendations. So if you could perhaps highlight just one or maximum two recommendations very briefly that have emerged from the work that you've done, that would be really excellent. And then we can come back to our virtual colleagues as well.
Okay, so one of our recommendations is tied to the findings that we got, which was that these kinds of partnerships don't have indefinite longevity if they're not institutionalized. And so having government actually put more skin in the game by actually providing a budget and having a specific department to manage this lab beyond the period of the collaboration is very key to ensure that this private sector data is continually funded for and can be utilized for development goals, will be one of the recommendations. And tied to this would also be the need to capacitate the county itself to also utilize, or rather to have the necessary skills to maintain this lab, not just relying on these private sector actors to keep the lab running. But that then brings another recommendation, which I wouldn't say is a recommendation per se, but a question we have up in the air that we would want these partners to think about, the issue of vendor lock-in. So these private sector companies, of course, are here to promote their own products, Airbus, Locate IT, Esri. But if we want to bring in other collaborators into the project, like there needs to be a way to move the partnership to a more abstracted position, such that other players, other providers of these technologies can also support the lab as and when is needed, and that there's no single point of failure from just one specific data provider or technology provider.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. And I'm sure we're going to come back to some of these themes. Already we've heard from our other panelists as well, the importance of establishing that enabling environment, of having that interlocutor effect, whether it's through government or a third party, and obviously that very close tie between skills and knowledge and the data itself. So with these reflections and thoughts in mind, perhaps we can come back to Helani now as well to just share very briefly one or two key recommendations that emerged from her case studies, and tell us a little bit more about them.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I think the first one is about intentionality. Data partnerships, particularly ones around data sharing, are hard, and too often we see one-off or siloed efforts. Leo talked about the difficulty of going beyond a single county and scaling up. One government department will enter a long negotiation with a private company for data, and it doesn't go beyond that. So to think about the partnership and how it will evolve over time is, I think, really important, and how it will scale up is important. Second is to recognize that when it comes to data sharing, there's value in one company partnering with civil society or government, but there's a lot more value for all parties if you have all the companies in that sector. So the classic example is governments trying to understand traffic by working with data from ride-hailing companies, usually one of the big ones. Every company has a good idea about traffic, but the pooled data really gives you an idea about traffic in the whole country or the city. So it's really useful for the companies. But now imagine if government also pools the data on the public bus service. That's now even more valuable, right? So there's really ways of incentivizing and value creation that we can think about. But this is not just about value creation, it's also about competition, keeping the doors open for the small players, in particular, those who weren't in the negotiations in the first place in these partnerships, to enter. That's good for competition, that's good for long term, and it's good for the development. The third is about policy and rules. Clarity on what can be shared, how and with whom is not obvious, particularly in the era that we have a lot of data protection regulations coming up. And that's an absolutely vital thing, right? And in fact, organizations that previously shared data together are now reluctant to do so because now suddenly there are new rules. But it is the role of governments to facilitate this policy environment around data sharing quite intentionally. Thanks.
Really interesting. And I mean, as people speak, it's becoming more and more clear to me that one concept more than anything else is really standing out here as the key to widespread success of these types of initiatives. And that is the ecosystem and everything that it takes to create that ecosystem between public and private sector actors, recognizing mutual value, having that enabling environment, which has both hard elements around policy and laws and guidance, and those soft elements around skills development and network building and the rest of it. So some really interesting reflections so far. Maurice, perhaps you could go next and just tell us what were one or two key recommendations that emerged from your research?
Okay, thanks, Tom. And I'm going to borrow Helani's term, intentionality. So one of the key things that emerged, it is interesting. It is apparent that many of the private sector organizations that we interacted with did not have SDGs as an explicit motivating factor front of mind. Even though it was relatively easy to align their programs, especially those focused on youth employability, livelihoods, quality education, to associate those with the corresponding SDGs. But they were not driven by a desire to contribute to the SDGs. We think that is important as a recommendation that the governments in the region need to be much more intentional in actively creating opportunities and vehicles for an ongoing dialogue with the private sector and other key partners regarding the opportunities for them to contribute to measuring, monitoring, and ultimately achieving the SDGs. At the moment, in many respects, it is just a reporting activity where they say, well, here's where we are. A more deliberate, intentional focus on driving these engagements, I think, can lead to greater participation and contributions. The second quick thing I'll mention, Tom, as a recommendation is, again, back to the point you just made about the ecosystem approach. We found that a deliberate ecosystem approach above and beyond the conventional bilateral approach to partnerships lends itself very well to much more scalable and much more self-sustaining data for development initiatives. So in our particular case, we found that the Trust for the Americas, in terms of the convening role that they played, facilitated very active, well-defined roles that other private sector actors, even small actors that potentially play an implementing role, could play, so that it opens up the whole sort of landscape for far more participation than sort of the traditional bilateral arrangements where you need big actors with deep pockets. So that ecosystem approach is quite important, and one that we certainly encourage governments to play a stronger facilitating role in encouraging that kind of arrangement. Those would be the two that I would highlight as recommendations.
Perfect, Maurice. Thank you so much. And again, it's just the what's really interesting to me, and this is getting ahead of ourselves to some degree, but what's really interesting to me is that despite operating in very different regions and undertaking research in very different regions, many of the themes are very, very similar. And I think that in and of itself is a massive opportunity, and I'd love us to discuss that in a few moments' time. But before doing that, of course, Hernan, does what you've heard so far resonate with you about the Latin America region? What are a couple of the recommendations that you have for stakeholders in that region? We're just waiting for Hernan to be unmuted. Try speaking. Can we hear you now?
Now I am. Yeah, sorry, I was
Perfect.
trying, but yeah, the host had to unmute me. Okay.
Perfect.
Well, as said, I think that broadly speaking, there are two major, I think, determinants affecting the private sector participation in the data agenda for the SDGs in the region. As said, the first one could be the enabling environment that could conduct to public and private initiatives. I also think that in Latin America, and we have identified that the regulatory frameworks in general must evolve in order to support this practice and the public and private data sharings and collaborations. In the second term, I could also highlight, as Maurice said, that maybe the 2030 agenda has lost a little bit of momentum and interest by the private sector, and many of the initiatives are not mainly focused to the 2030 agenda. Also, there are some initiatives, and I highlighted this also in my first intervention. But third, and this comes maybe from our second case study, that it was a case study that presented lessons of a data public good initiative carried out by Dimaxion Lab. That is a company that works with satellite images, and they have developed an app that generates maps of probable of slums and informal settlements. So one of the main lessons in that sense is they have been very successful partnering with the private sector and also with public sector. And I would say that for the data revolution, we have to understand that there are frameworks for the use of non-traditional data sources like this one that have been shown everywhere and have proven effectiveness and have made beyond the experimental stages, because there are many things that are still in experimental stages. But in these cases, they are having concrete impact. And this is the case of, for example, the satellitary images, the interoperability of administrative databases, the one I just also talk about, the use of scanner data. And these efforts, what I think is that they should be should focus on the efforts on the international cooperation and the efforts on trying to enhance data revolution should focus on these areas, because they have already proven to be successful. So that this would be also my contribution on what recommendations I would bring this one to have an impact in the short term with things that have already been working.
Excellent.
Over to you, Tom.
Really, they're just really interesting insights, as I said before, that have emerged, because there's so much similarity across the different regions. But I'd love to hear a little bit more as well about what differences exist between the different regions when it comes to these types of partnership. So Hernan, perhaps sticking with you, in your first comments, you said, and this really struck me, that there are data and initiatives, but a lack of data initiatives. And I think that that's a really good way of expressing the one of the challenges that we currently have. So could you tell us a little bit more about what's happening in the Latin America region to scale up data initiatives, and what's one of the points of what are a couple of the points of difference with the Latin America region compared to what you've heard from your colleagues as well? What are some of the regional differences? So a two-fold question there, just to clarify, what needs to happen to scale up, and what are some of the regional unique aspects of these types of partnership?
Sure. Yes. Well, I think, yes, it might be a little bit common within the regions, but especially in Latin America, as I said, there are data and there are initiatives, but there is a lack of data initiatives because the companies are more focused on reporting on. They are engaged with the 2030 agenda sometimes. They are engaged with the data agenda sometimes, but what we are lacking is these specific initiatives that somehow will strengthen the data ecosystem for reporting the 2030 agenda. This is what is more lacking, or maybe the specificity in our region. The companies are getting involved in public-private partnerships, but this is not that focused on the 2030 agenda, and in some cases it is not that focused in strengthening the data ecosystems. Sometimes you have isolated, we found isolated initiatives that maybe if they can start working jointly, or the governments can start gathering private sector companies, as it happens within Chile. There you got an example of how a government can gather a lot of companies and have a concrete data initiative that is having impact, and it's reducing cost, and it's streamlining a process. So bringing private sector data into the public good and making and strengthening the data ecosystem. So this could be one, I think, of the specificities in our region. And maybe again, the other one is I think that Latin America is a little bit behind in terms of the institutional frameworks, and they have to evolve if we want to see more of these public and private partnerships, and how they enhance the data revolution for having better data. So this would be the second specificity for Latin America, that the region is a little bit behind.
Thank you so much. And sticking to a geographically proximate region, perhaps Maurice, you could tell us a little bit more as well about some of the unique factors of the Caribbean region when it comes to public-private data initiatives. You've touched on a couple of themes already, which I think are really interesting. The first being the very strong link in the Caribbean region between public-private data initiatives and the skills building and capacity building components of those initiatives being a priority. It would be really interesting to hear a little bit more about why that is, what the reason for that is, and also whether there are any other unique factors or points of difference in the Caribbean region that you'd like to highlight.
Sure. So you're right, Tom. Very often in the literature, you see the Caribbean being characterized as data poor. And that has to do with the extent to which we have good quality public open data initiatives have stalled in many respects. And also the extent to which in the public sector and in the private sector, data is being used effectively to drive both policy and decision making. So when I compare the Caribbean's mapping activity that we did with the larger population of mapping activities across my colleagues and the other regions, it was clear that for us, by far the dominant data action related to education and training in digital and data skills, usually in combination with a propensity for employability and community development. So clearly there's a very strong sort of both perception and policy resonance among national stakeholders and international development partners that for the Caribbean, enabling youth empowerment and employability through digital and data capacity building is extremely important to the policy agenda at this point in time, and is seen as something that can help to build a kind of resilience against unattached or high-risk youth becoming victims and or perpetrators of crime and violence, so that it is an important part of the agenda at this point. And it's not surprising that the majority of the data actions that we saw and the majority of the resonance with the private sector that we saw related to this kind of digital literacy and data capacity building. I would say, Tom, and it actually relates to a recommendation I might have made earlier, that as we see this systematic investment in capacity building, we'd also like to see the private sector and private sector actors in the region expanding the range of data actions beyond capacity building and looking at more sort of value-added activities. So, transferring actionable data to the public sector or providing services like AI that can help the public sector's ability to extract insights from its own data repositories. So I think this is one of the things as a recommendation we'd like to see going forward. I mean, obviously the systematic capacity building is important, and it's sort of, a first level set of initiatives, but we have to begin to look beyond that, to look further up the value chain and to build on those kinds of capabilities.
Perfect. Thank you, Maurice. There's a lot to do there, but I do think that the focus on capacity building and digital skills, etc., is a really strong foundation. So I think that it's a good starting place, even as you say, there's also a moment now and it's time to move up the value chain. But I think it's a good starting place. Helani, perhaps you could share some insights with us as well about some of the unique aspects that you came across in the East Asia region. So over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm actually not sure if any of this is unique, because I heard things that are very common to our region in both the two previous speakers. But I guess the difference, for example, is if you look at Asia, so South and Southeast Asia that we looked at, instead of capacity building, data sharing was the most common partnership initiative that we saw. For example, our mapping study looked at 52 such instances in just 14 countries involving private sector and mostly related to climate change, right? So the first, the thing I think again quite common is skill and awareness of the value of data and the ability to manipulate and use this data. This is still quite low. And I think this is in part why we have these one-off initiatives that start with great fanfare. So, governments are still in the early stages, and they think these partnerships and the way we use data and the models can be taken from a very developed country without customization. That is not how it works. We are resource poor, the language algorithms don't work, we have much smaller sets of data, and so on. All the challenges apart from skill, right? So really that has to be developed. And governments have a hard time engaging with private sector too. Instead of just seeing them as a organization that sponsors something, partnerships are quite difficult to build with government in the region. Statistics officers are mandated to collect census data and extrapolate, and may not have the policy frameworks in South Asia to actually use private sector data like telecom data in between censuses to work on it. So there are all these challenges that they need to overcome. I think there's also an opportunity. Ironically, if we look at a lot of the partnerships, the really successful ones have come at these pivotal crisis moments, right? COVID was one of the speakers touched upon it. Suddenly you saw, Facebook and all the telecom companies talking and working with government to understand movement data. The Nepal earthquake really brought together expertise, I think, from Flowminder and the mobile telecom companies to understand the effects of the earthquake in a way no other data could, right? So, if we are looking for crisis, South Asia has enough. And I was just thinking, while Dan was talking, Sri Lanka is going through an economic crisis with very high inflation and not really being able to get a handle quantitatively. So, surely we should be not just looking to the north, but looking at the South-South cooperation of the kind of example that he talked about and use that kind of implementation in a country like Sri Lanka, right? Which I think would be doable if somebody is willing to sort of negotiate that. Thanks.
That's a really, really interesting point and a really interesting insight. And I think the one of the it's something that hasn't been raised so far in this conversation, but I think is hugely valuable, that South-South knowledge transfer when it comes to data initiatives, I think is potentially a really big opportunity. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Leonida back to the stand as well, and to share just very briefly a couple of insights about some of the unique features and regional attributes of the partnerships in East Africa. I can't hear. I'm not sure. Can others hear? Leonida?
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
We can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was saying that one of the unique aspects of the sort of partnerships we mapped and reviewed in this region that I'd like to highlight is on the issue of these partnerships addressing very unique, very niche problems, problem sets. So for instance, I talked about the GIS lab that's been established in a very specific region within Kenya. Another initiative that we also came across was the drone delivery services for health and mapping in Rwanda. These use cases are very unique to each of these contexts and face the issue of scalability, one, but secondly, the data that is in use by these partnerships are actually, most of them that we observed are from multinationals, primarily because I think they do have the resourcing and the legal framework to support data sharing and data usage beyond private sector use, which is something that startup companies or smaller private sector entities within the region may not have those frameworks to support the usage or even the muscle to work with either government or large public institutions to use data. So one thing that we think is important, and we have also seen this as an example from the Bureau of Statistics in Kenya, is a very clearly spelled out framework of utilizing private data for more national or public goods, in this case, supporting the development goals. These frameworks are in the form of guidances on how, if you are producing, however small of a player you are in the ecosystem, data sets that can be utilized beyond the usual surveys and the usual sensors, provides guidance on how you can streamline it for statistics purposes and for development purposes. So I think those frameworks can support other actors coming into the space, but also producing more data beyond the niche use cases that we saw working in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, LIRNeasia. It's been a really interesting discussion so far. We only have a couple of minutes. I do want to just very briefly open the floor to see whether we have any reflections perhaps from the audience. I don't think we have enough time for questions, but if anyone has any very, very brief reflections they'd like to share, please do jump in. And that invitation also extends to some of the panelists and to Philip as well, who gave opening remarks earlier. So over to you. And in the meantime, I'm just going to share my screen briefly and highlight a URL where you can find more information about this project. But from me, thank you so much to everybody and to the organizers. And I'll come back in a moment just to say goodbye. But over to comments from the audience.
Tom, since we have 2 minutes left on our official
Please,
program, maybe we can wrap it up with the reflections of what comes, of course, next, and what a clear and agreed vision of success for 2030 looks like from a data revolution perspective. And this is not only seen by researchers, but by the companies itself. So this stock-taking exercises that identify actually those strengths, the weaknesses, it's what a meaningful way forward and have an action plan that actually enables data as a political and good governance issue, and especially that we have a stronger progress in enabling of responsible public-private partnerships. And I think we saw very important examples today of how this is done. We still have a long way to go, because the missing link that we still need, it's actually the possibility to move forward with the private sector towards 2030. But we, as you mentioned, within a policy framework and a South-South cooperation among practitioners that helps us to move forward. So this was within the 30 seconds I was given the answer, Tom, and over to you. Thank you, colleagues and people in China who have accompanied us here today. It has really been a good opportunity for us to share our knowledge, and hopefully it has been helpful for you as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Philip, for that overview of what comes next and some of the links to further initiatives. From my side, we're now at the hour. I'd just like to thank the panelists so much for taking the time to share their insights. For some of our panelists, it's very, very early in the morning, so thank you so much for taking the time. And I'd also just like to take a moment to thank the organizers of the World Data Forum for hosting us. On the URL that is, hopefully you can see on the screen before you, you will find all the case studies and mapping work relating to this project. The mapping work is already uploaded. The case studies are fresh off the press and will be uploaded to the website in the very near future. So please do keep a lookout for updates. So from me, thank you so much, and back to the organizers.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.